A quorum is not present.
Mr. President, I move to instruct the Sergeant at Arms to request the presence of absent senators, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a second? Sufficient second. There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal,
So you have me down.
yes, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar,
No.
Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy. Sir. Thank you. How you doing? Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran.
Present.
Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,